So we have solved a particular problem, and the problem is uh, calculation of area of a given circuit. So the problem definition is like this. Then we are thinking some algorithm steps how to solve this problem, and then we are writing some code. So whenever we are writing a code, we have to remember. So when we are writing a code, we have to remember these things: the variables or data. So you can say this is data definition. Whatever data you are using in your program, in your code, you have to first define it or declare it. Okay, so this is the data. Data can be variables or constant. Okay, so first of all, the first thing is you have to define them. Then you have to, in your algorithm, you have already defined what is the inputs and what are the outputs. Okay, so the next thing is you have to take the input. Then the next thing you have to perform some operations to solve the problem. Generally, we solve mathematical problems, and means for a particular means the problem must be mathematically solvable. Otherwise, it is very difficult to convert it in some code. Okay. Generally, we use mathematical problems. And the next thing is we have to give the output. Okay. So this is the steps we have to follow. So following the steps, we have defined the data we have used. This is a variable, this is another variable, this is a constant. So the definition or declaration of data, then the input, this is the input, then some operation to get the value of the area, and finally the output. So these steps we have to follow. And before going to the break, I have already told you that this whole thing must be under a function which is called main. Now, what is the use and why we use main? I'm going to that. So it is, you can say, C language is kind of modular programming. Now, what do you mean by modular programming? Modular programming means my whole task is divided into some smaller tasks which are called modules. So these are the smaller tasks, the whole task which is divided into some smaller tasks. Now, this task number 1 is called input. This task number 2 is called operation. This task number 3 is called output. Okay. So the whole task is divided into some smaller tasks. And there must be some main task which will control all this task. Okay. So I am giving you one example. Suppose I have to submit the electricity bill. I have to submit the electricity bill. Okay. I can submit the electricity bill by going myself to the electric office, but I'm not going to the electric office. Instead of going to the electric office, I'm calling someone else to submit the electricity bill. So I'm calling someone. Suppose I am calling A1. So now A1 will solve the problem. So it means this electricity bill is the main problem or main task. To solve that task, I am calling another task, A1. This is the meaning of this modular programming concept. This main program is calling different tasks to solve the problem. Now see, this input and output, this two task is huge task. These two are very important and very huge tasks. This is not a simple task. This operation in this solution, this operation is very simple. But this input and output task is very difficult, or a, you can say, a long procedure. Why? Because in this input and output you have to access the hardwares. You have to access the hardwares. When you are considering the input, you have to take the input from the keyboard. So from keyboard you have to convert it, you have to store it in memory, so you are accessing the hardwares. So this is a huge task. Similarly, when you are printing something, you are printing on the screen. From memory, you are printing on the screen. So it is again a huge task. These two tasks are all from this main task. So when I am compiling, I will compile which one? I will compile the main. Now, what do you mean by compiling? Compiling, you have to convert your code from a source code, which is written in high level language, into some machine level. Now, for that compiler must know which one I have to compile. So, that is already defined or predefined. Whatever written inside main, you have to compile that thing. Logic clear? Why this main is coming? And if you remember this, and I hope some of you already know that main is the function which is very important function. It is not. And another very interesting thing, this main function, remember, this is purely user defined function. This is not a C or library function. This printf, scanf, these are library functions. But main is user defined function. Now, what do you mean by user defined function? User defined function means when you are defining some set of instruction under a particular function, according to your choice, according to your requirement, then you say it is user defined. When you are using some predefined function, just like printf, scanf, and many other functions, those are already defined in our C library. We are just calling them. Then these functions are called predefined, all library functions. But this main is user defined. Why? Because every time you are writing your own main. But I've already told you which thing compiler have to compile. That is already defined into compiler, that you have to compile whatever written inside the main. So first thing that compiler will do, compiler will search this main function, this main keyword. So remember, each and every C program must have a main function, because compiler has to start its compilation from the main function. That's why we have to put all the things inside a main. Inside a main, we have to put all the things inside a main. And what type of function is main? Since we are defining, so this is the definition. Main, this is the definition. This is the definition. We are changing this definition every time. That's why main is, remember, user defined function. But a special type of user defined function, you cannot change the name of the main, no capital, always it is in small letters, and then the function symbol, this is called function symbol. Okay, you have to remember this, that main must be there in your program. From main, see, from main we are calling scanf. Scanf is one kind of library function. Then we are calling printf. This is another library function. So this is like this, that main, the main problem is I have to submit the electricity bill. To submit the electricity bill, I am calling different functions. Okay, so this thing should be clear from the start of the classes, that we have to write a main function. From the main function we can call other functions. Now I have already told that C is combination of functions. There are different modules or functions. Function means, what is function? Function means task, what you have to done. That is function. So in C language there are different functions. There are two types of function. One is called C functions, or you can say library functions, or you can say predefined function. These functions are already defined. Okay, this is one type of function, and there is another type of function which you are declaring, you are defining according to your requirement. That's why it is called user defined function. Okay, now this function, this type of functions already defined in header files, and that's why we have to include the header files. We have to include the header files. Those who have already written some C programs, you can remember that you have to first write hash include stdio.h. Now what is the meaning of this stdio.h? Standard, std for standard input output, I for input, O for output. Standard input output. Standard input function is scanf, and standard output function is printf. So you are just including this header file where this two definition is already written, clear? And you are not defining, see, you are not defining this two function. You are not defining scanf and printf because it is already defined. You are just calling it. These are function calling. Okay, you are defining this. Suppose this is another function. Suppose instead of writing this statement, I am using a function void. So I will go how to write a function void func. So inside that I have written some statements. I am calling it from this position. So I will write the function here. So now after this scanf, this function will be called. But since this is user defined function, I have to define it in the same program. But if it is a library or C function, no need to define it. It is already defined. And I have already included the header file. I have already included the definition in my program. And then I am calling it. Okay, very clear. Because why I am calling a particular function? Because there are different, many other standard input output function, but we are just calling printf and scan. And remember, main is user defined because this function you are writing this function, and it is changing. For a prime number check, you have to write a different function, main function. For area of circle, you have to write a different main function. So that's why main is, remember, it is always user defined function. Okay, now we have already defined that the steps which we have to follow. The first thing is we have to define the data that we will going to use in my program, in my code. Then I have to use the input, then operation, then output. Now when we are saying data definition, so we have already seen there are basically two types of data. So data, two types of data. One is called variable and another is called constant. Now what is variable? Variable means, variable is a you can say one kind of entity which will store values used in your computation. So this will store values which will use for your computation. And constant, it is a fixed which also store values, but it is fixed. It cannot be changed. Okay, so this is the basic difference. Now, these variables when you are defining some variables in your program, you have to follow some rules. Means you cannot use any name as a variable name. See, before the variable name, you have to define. So along with data, you have to give the data types also. And we have already seen the basic data types are int, float, char. Okay. So first we will see how to write a variable name or constant name, how to write it. Now remember, whenever you are writing a variable name, it can have characters, digits, and some special characters like underscore. So you can create a variable name with these things, character, digits, and underscore. But you have to follow the rules. So these are the grammars now we are discussing. So every language should have some grammar. So the first grammar is for a variable name. What is the grammar? Grammar is it should be start with character. It should start with character or underscore. Any variable name can start with character or underscore, but not with digits. So A8, a valid variable name, but 8A is not valid. Similarly, underscore A is valid. Okay. Now you can use any number of character, any number of underscore, any number of digits to represent your variable name. There is some restrictions how many characters you can use, and it is depend on the language you are using, or sometimes it depends on compiler. But generally, you can use any number of character underscore, and you can use uppercase, lowercase, both. Okay, so whenever you are defining any variable name, you have to remember that it should not start with digits, but you can start it with character or underscore. You can use any number of character, any number of underscore. There is a length restriction depending on the compiler. Okay, and another rule you have to remember, the next very important thing, whenever you are using variable name, it should not be any keywords. In C language there are some keywords such as auto, break, continue. There are many different keywords, more or less more than 32 keywords are there. So these keywords cannot be used as variable name. These keywords cannot be used as variable name, because what is the meaning of these keywords? They are the basic building block, backbones of the C language. Using these keywords, you can write your C language programs. So that's why you cannot change these keywords. Means you cannot use these keywords as variables. Variables should be depending on your requirement, and it should follow these rules. Okay, then there are constants. For constants, you can use the same naming concept, same as variable naming concept. Okay, now again we are coming back to function. So what is the function? So function is, what is function in C language? Function, you can say function is any task or work to do. Okay, now there are two types of function. One is I've already defined, C function or library function or predefined functions, and user defined. Now remember, for a function there are basically three things you have to use for a function. The first thing is you have to define or declare a function. You have to call the function, and there is another interesting thing which is called function prototype. Okay. But remember, this is optional. So basically, you have to define and then you have to call. But remember, for user defined function, you have to do both these two. Okay, but for library functions, you have to only do this. Logic clear? Means if you use any library function, just like printf, scanf, getch, there are many different library functions. You just have to call it. Okay, but if you are writing some user-defined function, then you must have to define it, and then you have to call it. Okay, and this third thing, this function prototype, is optional. Why it is optional? I am coming to that. Now suppose I am writing a function to add two numbers. I am writing a function to add two numbers. Add two integer numbers. So I have already told you that it is integer numbers. So I have to add. So the problem definition is C equal to A plus B. These are the two numbers and this is the addition. Okay, so these two are input and this is the output. So now I have to go for the code. So how to write the code? So I have already told you that every function should start with main. So I'm writing the main function, main. Okay. So what is the first thing that we have to do? We have to define the data that we must use in this function. So what are the datas? C, A, B. These are the datas. And since we are adding to integer numbers, so all the datas are integer. So what is the data type? Integer. So I will write it like this. Int. So one variable name is C. This is not a keyword and having character. Another A, not a keyword, only character. Another B. So these are the three variables we require to solve this problem. Okay, and then this is very important. We are using a semicolon. Now, what is the meaning of this semicolon? The meaning of semicolon is end of statement. So in C language, same as your Bengali or English language, you have to end a statement. In Bengali, we use dari. In English, we call it full stop. In C language, we use semicolon to represent end of the statements. Okay. Now, after this end of the statement, you can write the next statement. So these are the variable definition, data definition done. Now what we will do, we will go for input. So we are going to taking the input. So for input taking, we will use scanf function. Now what is the meaning of this %d and ampersand a comma ampersand b? I'm coming to that. Okay. Then I'm calling a function add. Okay. A comma B. I'm passing the values and then the printf. So if I print here, so I need the return value. Okay, so I'm printing the value C. So this is the main function. Now from this main function, I have called this one, this library function. Then I have called this one. This is user defined function. Then I have called this one. This is again library function. So I've already told you for user defined function, you have to define it. So I'm writing the definition. Okay. Now the definition will be like this: integer add integer a comma integer b, and then the definition of the function is returned a plus b. So this is the definition. Okay. So how this program will run? The program will run in this sequence. So this is the first statement that will be executed by the compiler. Then this is the second statement, scanf taking input. Then this is the third statement. Whenever it will get the third statement, the control will move into the function because I am calling that function. It will execute or compile all these things. Then the return statement, it will return back to this function. Then it will execute this statement. So step by step, sequentially, it will execute all the statements. Okay. So see, for this input and output function, we are using hash include stdio.h. We are including this header file. We are using this header file. Okay. And for the main function, we are for this function, there is a user defined function. We are defining it and we have call it. So this is the calling, this is the calling, this is the calling, and this is the definition of the user defined function. So you have to remember this thing, that whenever you are defining your own function, your user defined function, it must be defined. Okay. Now, when I am defining why I am using this in, then I will discuss about this, no problem. Now, I have told you that there is another thing which is called function prototype. See, I have not used this function prototype here, but if I define this one, this is the definition of my user defined function. This is the definition: int add int a comma int b. This is the definition. This is the definition of my user defined function. So if I define this function after the main function in this position, if I define this, then I have to use the function prototype. Is it clear? When I will use the prototype, I will use the prototype when, so prototype will be used when an user defined function is defined after its calling. Is it clear? When I will use the prototype, if my user defined function, this is my user defined function, if the definition is after, in this position I am calling, and then the definition is there, then I have to use the prototype. But here I have defined it before it's calling. See, before the main function I have defined the add function. It means it is defined before it's calling. So no need of prototype. When prototype will be required? If we define the function after its calling, we have to use the prototype. And for this function, what is the prototype? And the prototype will be like this: int add int comma int semicolon. This is the function prototype you have to use if you define the function after its calling. So better choice is no need to go for this prototype. How you can remove this prototype part? By defining the function, or suppose you have write the function here, just copy it, cut from there and copy it before the main. Then no need of function prototype. That's why I have written that this prototype is optional. But this two things is very important. This thing is important whenever you are defining user defined function or calling a library function, and this part is important when you are creating your own user defined function. I hope this thing is clear. Now, how I am writing these things, I will discuss about this. Before, I will first discuss the input function, that is very important, and the output function. The main input function we generally use, the main input function is scanf. Okay, and the syntax of the scanf is like this. This is the keyword, and then you have to give the format string. Remember this thing, you have to give the format string first. Then after this comma, you can write the address of variables. Okay, so this is the syntax for a scanf or input function. Now, what do you mean by format string? First, string. String means in C language or more or less except Python, the string is represented by this quotation, double quotation. Okay, so you have to write here. You have to write the format string. Now the string will be represented like this. Now this is the format. In which format you are taking the variables, whether it is integer or float or character. If it is integer, you have to write %d, decimal, d for decimal. If it is float, %f. If it is a character, %c, character. So these are the format string that you have to write in case of scanf. So for any integer input, the format string will be %d, then comma. Then what you have to give? You have to give the address of the variable. Now the next question is how we will give the address of the variable. Now why this address of the variable is important? See, we have defined some variables. So whenever we are defining some variables, this variable will be allocated in our RAM. Some memory will be allocated. Okay, some memory will be allocated. Suppose this memory is allocated for variable A and it should have some address. Suppose the address is alpha. So how to get the address? Why we need the address? Because when the user will give some input through the keyboard, when the user will give some input, it will be stored in this memory location. So the user should know what is the address of the memory location. So that's why when we are taking input, we need the address. How to get the address? In C language, to get the address, the operator used is ampersand. This is called ampersand operator. Remember, here it is used as unary operator. It can be used as binary also. So when you are using this ampersand operator as unary, it will give you the address of the variable. So when I'm writing ampersand A, it will return me the address of variable A. So alpha here, alpha. Okay. So why we need the address? Because the user will give some value through its keyboard and I have to store it in my memory, RAM. So that's why we need the address. So I hope you now understand why this syntax scanf having this ampersand. See, when I am taking two input, I am writing %d, %d twice for taking two input. Then how many inputs? All the inputs will be separated by comma. So first input address ampersand A, second input address, first input address ampersand A, second input address ampersand B. So we have to use these addresses. Okay. So this is the syntax of a scanf. Whenever you are writing a scanf, it is a common mistake to forget this ampersand. But remember, whenever it is a scanf, you have to give the syntax in a form of address, and this address we can get using the operator ampersand operator. Okay, logic clear? Next, this is for input, and the next one is the output. Next one is the output. For output, we generally use the printf. Again, the syntax is first the format string. You have to write something in a string format, and then variable names. Variable names. Remember, in scanf, we need the address of the variable. Address of the variable. In printf, we need only the variable name. Only the variable name, comma. All the variable names. So this is the syntax for printf. So if I want to print variable A, which is integer, int a5, a is a variable having value 5, it is integer. Then how I will print it? I will print it printf. First the format string. What is the format? It is integer. So %d, then the variable name a. That's all. But if it is a scanf statement, if I want to take input, then it will be written like this: scanf, but the first the format string %d. Okay, then we need the address of a, because I have to put the value in this address, so I have to write it ampersand a. So that's why we need ampersand in scanf, but not ampersand in printf. But we can use ampersand. Suppose I use ampersand here, what will happen? Printf %d ampersand a. If I write it, anyone, you can unmute yourself and can give me the answer. If I write it, is it correct or wrong? Is it correct or wrong?
Correct.
Why? I have already told
No,
you
sir,
that.
not correct.
I have already told you that in case of scanf we use ampersand, but in case of printf we never use ampersand. But if I use ampersand, what will happen?
Sir, we'll
See,
get
the
the address of A.
Okay. So if you want to see in which address location your variable is stored, then you can do it using this statement. So in printf, if you write ampersand a, it will print the address of the variable. So the pictorial representation will be like this. So this is your variable location. Suppose the address is 1005. This is the address. And the name of the address is A, and it is having some value 5. So if I define int A equal to 5, the pictorial representation will be like this. So if I printf %da means value of A. Now value of A, it will print 5. If I write ampersand A, it will give ampersand A means, I have already told you, ampersand A means address of the variable, address of variable A. What is the address? This one. So if I write %d comma ampersand A in my printf statement, I will get 1005. So if I want to check what is the address, then I can use ampersand A. Otherwise, generally printf don't require any ampersand, but in case of scanf, you must have to use the scan ampersand, otherwise it will be no syntax error, but it will give you some runtime error. Sometimes in some compiler it will give you syntax error also, but generally it will give you some runtime error. Okay. So I think I have discussed too much.